Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you that don't know me, hi, I'm Rachel and I'm an Egyptology PhD candidate at the University of Liverpool. And in this video I'm going to be answering a question that I get asked quite a lot, which is what is Egyptology? So if you want to know more about what Egyptology is and how it started, please keep watching. So a few weeks ago I made a video on some things that I wish I'd known before I started studying Egyptology, and I'll leave a link in the description if you guys haven't seen it. But one of the things I mentioned was the fact that nobody really seems to know what Egyptology actually is, so I thought I'd make a video on that so people can actually find out what exactly it is. I also want to make a few more of these introduction kind of videos to various topics in Egyptology, so if you want to see more of them, give this video a like and let me know in the comments what kind of topics you want to hear about and learn about. But for this first one, I thought I'd make a general introduction to Egyptology and tell you a bit about what it involves and how it kind of came about as a discipline. Egyptology is quite self-explanatory from the name. It is basically just the study of Egypt. And traditionally it's kind of thought of as the study of ancient Egypt, but it's actually expanding quite a bit to encompass medieval Egypt and modern Egypt as well at the moment. And within this kind of broad study of Egypt, there are quite a lot of disciplines and specialities that Egyptologists can specialise in. For example, my research is all about the Egyptian language, but you'll also get Egyptologists who will specialise in things that people will traditionally think of when they think of ancient Egypt, so like pyramids and mummies and things like that. But there are also loads of other specialisms as well, so there's like religion, art, architecture, literature, history, even into things like reception studies and gender studies, geology. You could go on forever listing these things. But basically, because Egyptology is the study of a particular area, it then encompasses loads of different specialisms, so we can learn as much as possible about all the different aspects of Egypt and its societies. So it's really naturally quite an interdisciplinary subject. The interdisciplinary nature of Egyptology can generally be traced back to what we typically think of as the origins of modern Egyptology, which is generally considered to be with the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798. But as you'll see from the story, the origins of Egyptology, and also Egyptology into even the 20th century, is absolutely full of colonialism. And this colonialism is something that's being discussed quite a lot by Egyptologists at the moment, but it's just something that if you're studying Egyptology or if you're just interested, which I guess you probably are if you're watching this video, but it's just something to be aware of if you're reading earlier books about ancient Egypt. There are a few things that are said by earlier Egyptologists that were obviously considered okay in this colonialist environment, but that we definitely would not consider to be okay today. And these colonialist ideas even come from people that we consider to be great archaeologists or great Egyptologists. For example, there's William Flinders Petrie, who has been labelled as the father of archaeology. You might have heard of him. He's considered to be a great archaeologist, but he also had an interest in eugenics and racial hierarchy, and he collected skulls and measured them. So yeah, with that warning, back to Napoleon and his invasions. So Napoleon's main goals for his invasion of Egypt were obviously mainly military. He wanted to overthrow the Ottoman rule of Egypt and turn Egypt into a French colony. But he also had some longer term goals, including disrupting the British control of certain sea routes, and also he wanted to build a canal through Suez for trade purposes, which actually ended up being done about 70 years later. The French director agreed to Napoleon's plans to invade Egypt in March 1798, and the French fleet set sail about 2 months later in May. And it was really, really secret. Of all the people that were on the ships, only Napoleon and about 3 other people actually knew where they were headed, and this was in order to stop them being intercepted by the British. On the way to Egypt, they actually ended up invading Malta as well, and this wasn't entirely intentional. They hadn't set out deciding to invade Malta as well as Egypt, but when they got to Malta and they needed to resupply their ships, the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta said that only 2 foreign ships could come in at one time, which would have made resupplying the French ships take weeks and probably allow the British to catch up with them, which they really didn't want. So Napoleon basically decided, you know what, it'll just be quicker to just invade Malta, resupply the ships and move on. So the French ended up invading Malta and were actually in charge of Malta for about 3 months during 1798. And then once they'd resupplied the ships, most of the French fleet continued on to Egypt and landed in Alexandria on the 1st of July 1798 to begin their invasion. But alongside the tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors who came with Napoleon to actually invade Egypt, there was a much smaller group of about 165 scholars. And this was made up of some of France's leading scholars at the time, from a really wide range of disciplines. So there were artists, mathematicians, cartographers, chemists, all sorts of scientists, and really people from every specialism that you could think of. And the original goal that was given to these scholars by Napoleon was to gather as much information about Egypt as they could, to aid France in colonising Egypt, and then once they'd colonised it, to aid in governing it. So this mostly involved gathering technical information, like measuring buildings and things like that, and also gathering information on Egypt's contemporary society and its people. But these scholars also had another goal initially, and there's a quote from one of the mathematicians that says one of their aims was to carry the torch of reason to a country which for a long time had been without enlightenment, to extend the domain of philosophy and carry national glory afar. So again, with the colonialist views here, the French at the time obviously considered Egypt to be an unenlightened country. Napoleon scholars soon also became pretty fascinated with the visible remnants of the ancient Egyptian civilization, and added the goal of discovering more about ancient Egypt to their aims of describing the contemporary Egyptian civilization. And they had loads of resources available from the French military and the French government. So just over a year after they landed at Alexandria, they reached Aswan in the south of Egypt, having excavated and recorded a lot of Egyptian monuments along their way. In August 1798, Napoleon and his scholars established a central research institute in Cairo, which was called the Institute of Egypt. It originally had 48 members, so not all of the 165 scholars who had come on the expedition. Obviously, some of them were still on their way to Aswan, and many of them were in different parts of Egypt at this time. But the 48 scholars who did join were originally organised into 4 groups, so one covering maths, one covering physics and natural history, one covering political economy, and the other one covering literature and arts. And the Institute was originally designed to provide a central location through which the scholars of various different disciplines could come and share their research about Egypt through seminars and discussions with each other. And the institute set up by the French scholars does actually still exist today, although it's been through a few temporary closures and a couple of name changes, but it's now known as the Egyptian Scientific Institute. There were a number of publications from individual scholars that were associated with the institute, as well as a series of collaborative works from several of the scholars. But easily the most impressive of these was the Description of Egypt, which was published between 1809 and 1829 and consisted of about 24 volumes, 10 of which contained illustrations, and there were over 3,000 illustrations in there. And this included studies of Egypt's natural world, so the animals and plants and geography, as well as studies of both the contemporary Egyptian society and its ancient one. And the publications from the French scholars generated a lot of public interest in France, as well as in the rest of Europe and in Northern America. And unsurprisingly, it wasn't the illustrations of things like fish and birds that captures people's interest, but the illustrations and information about the ancient Egyptian society and their art and the writings and the various sort of mysteries that were still associated with it. And among sort of interested members of the public, this kind of fascination with Egypt became evident through their use of Egyptian motifs in architecture and furniture at the time, the use of small obelisks as gravestones, which you can still see in graveyards today, and a weird sort of fascination with mummies and the use of them for everything from medicines to fertilizer to paint. But more importantly for Egyptology itself, the work of the French scholars generated interest that led to a lot of further study of Egypt and its civilizations. For example, in 1801, one of the mathematicians that had accompanied Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was visited by a then 11-year-old Jean-Francois Champollion, who we now credit with the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the continued study of ancient Egypt as a consequence of Napoleon's expedition and the French scholars that he took with him has led to an entire discipline of its own, which we now call Egyptology. And the nature of Egyptology itself has also been heavily impacted by Napoleon and his expedition, especially due to the interdisciplinary nature of Egyptology and all the various different specialisms within it. And the work of the French scholars has also been really useful in other ways. For example, a lot of the monuments they recorded very accurately, and some of them have since been destroyed in the last sort of 200 years. So these records that were made by the French scholars are actually now really useful for any Egyptologists to use these monuments still as evidence, despite the fact that the original architecture no longer survives. But we still have enough evidence recorded to be able to use them to test a hypothesis, for example. And given the limited nature of the evidence that we have from ancient Egypt, these records can be incredibly useful. Obviously, having the original monuments would be nice, but since they have been destroyed, these records that we have are really the next best thing. And as well as publishing the work, the French scholars also began to gather collections of Egyptian antiquities, and this really formed the basis of Egyptology as a museum science. And the collections at the French Institute helped provide the forerunners for the Cairo Museum and also the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is opening soon. But probably the most important impact that the scholars with Napoleon actually had on Egyptology was to provide sort of a definition of what it actually is. And the wide range of specialisms of the 165 French scholars actually impacted the way that we study Egyptology today and gave it its interdisciplinary nature and provided all of the specialisms that Egyptologists can focus on. And the reason that we study things like language and history and art and religion of Egypt all under one discipline is due to the collaboration of the scholars of different disciplines who accompanied Napoleon, both in their discussions and seminars and also in their published works. And this is why at the beginning of this video I was able to just simply define Egyptology as the study of Egypt. So that basically sums up what Egyptology is and one of the reasons why it's like that. And obviously, as I said, Egyptology encompasses loads of different subjects. So if there are any that you do want to hear about, as I said in the beginning of the video, let me know in the comments and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. But for now, that is all for this video, so I'll see you in my next one.